The Uriah story. So I'll go ahead and read the text. It said, "The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, 'There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity.' Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives in your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord, by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites.' Then David said to Nathan, 'I have sinned against the Lord.' Nathan replied, 'The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die.' After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill." And it talks about in the lesson context, at the time of today's lesson, the Israelite army was fighting the Ammonites. And this is at about 990 BC. And it says the backdrop for us is a siege on the Ammonite capital, Rabbah. This was located at the site of the modern city of Ammon in Jordan, situated at the sources of the Jabbok River. The city was about 40 miles east of Jerusalem. And it says, with a good general directing his army, a king could stay home to take care of administrative concerns or personal matters. And King David had such a man, a general, in Joab. Joab was a fierce and unrelenting warrior at that time, very loyal to David. One day while home, David seemed to be enjoying a nap on the roof. After waking, he began to walk around the roof. And it says the highest point in Jerusalem was Mount Zion. Next to the mount on the south side was David's palace, making his rooftop the second highest position in the small city. This is how David could have observed activity on a nearby rooftop. And everybody knows this story. What David saw was the woman Bathsheba performing a ritual bath for purification. It says David may have known Bathsheba's family, for her father was Eliam, thought to be the son of one of David's counselors. King David's notice of Bathsheba quickly turned to lust, and he ended up sleeping with her, which resulted in a pregnancy. David tried to influence her husband Uriah to go to his own house before returning to battle. That way everyone except David and Bathsheba would think that the baby was Uriah's. But Uriah's sense of honor kept him from spending time with his wife. And little did Uriah know that his sense of honor sealed his fate, as he carried his own death warrant back to Joab. After Uriah's death, David took Bathsheba as his own wife, and 9 months later, it looked as though David had gotten away with these crimes. So it talks about in the first verse, when the Lord sent Nathan to David, knowing what we know of David and his character, this whole story was kind of out of character for him anyway, but you got to think, you're going to the king basically to confront him on a crime that, as far as he knows, nobody's aware of. And the first verse was, the Lord sent Nathan to David. And it says, biblical narratives often present people's actions without offering God's evaluation of their deeds. But the writer of 2 Samuel could not resist the arresting understatement. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Nothing is known of the prophet Nathan other than what is recorded in conjunction with David's reign. Prophets existed in Israel before the monarchy, but their number and role seemed to have increased after a human king was enthroned. 2 prophets were called directly by the Lord. Among their important roles was to hold Israel's civil authorities in check. All in all, the prophet Nathan demonstrated respect for the Lord's anointed and fear of the Lord that led him to take on a potentially suicidal mission before David. 1b, when he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. And it said Nathan could have chosen a more direct approach to confronting David, but he chose this parable, which, as we go through the verses, you can see how he kind of paints it to him. Old Testament prophets often use metaphors and symbolism to speak against evil in their nation, or to even entrap the king with his own ruling. This description of two men in a certain town primed David for a story of conflict. The fact that one was rich and the other poor further heightened the likelihood of conflict, especially of injustice based on a disparity of power. So he's kind of using David's own character and his emotions against him here. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing. Since farm animals were an indication of wealth, the difference in power and status between the two men was made more apparent from the description of what both men possessed. Nathan's choice of sheep and cattle as principal indicator of wealth likely resonated with David, who grew up working as a shepherd for his family. It also set the potential conflict between the two as more emotional than if only gold was at stake. So, I mean, David comes from this background. So the fact that you're already talking about a disparity and injustice, and then you kind of paint his background into the story, he's just, as the story goes, he's getting more invested in it. Verse 3b, except one little ewe lamb he had bought, he raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. It says, with expert rhetorical flair, Nathan piled on more detail about the nearness and dearness of the one little ewe lamb to the poor man. David had protected his father's sheep fiercely. Nathan's story would have stirred David's sympathies even before the crime was revealed. So he hasn't even told him, he hasn't even confronted him yet, but he's already got him. Nathan's story also contains hints at its meaning. That the sheep slept in the man's arms alludes to David's holding Bathsheba. That the sheep was like a daughter to him also hints at Bathsheba, whose name means something like daughter of abundance. For those in the know, it's obvious what Nathan is getting at, but still not to David. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. It says, in the days before hotels and restaurants, it was unremarkable for a traveler to seek room and board from a private citizen. I mean, how many of us now, somebody's randomly walking down your road and oh yeah, come here, you can stay the night here. No, I know those that we see walking the road now are, I digress. Any virtuous person, wealthy or not, in the ancient world practiced hospitality to prevent a stranger from becoming the victim of violence. The rich man followed convention by preparing a meal for the visitor, but such hospitality, he may have reasoned, was the responsibility of the whole town and not just himself. He therefore confiscated the poor man's lamb for the occasion. No one hearing the story would believe that the man was justified in this, especially given the wealth disparity between the two citizens. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. It says the difference in status and resources between the two men, combined with the rich man's heartless action, made the guilt of the rich man appallingly clear. David's initial instinct as judge was to pass the death sentence on to the man for his egregious behavior, which ironically would be appropriate for both adultery and murder, but not theft. So David reacts to this pretty harshly, but he still has no idea, he's talking about himself. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. And perhaps realizing that death was not a prescribed punishment for the theft of a lamb, no matter how precious, David gave a more realistic verdict. 4-fold recompense is the stipulated penalty in Exodus for stealing a sheep. David did not realize that he had stepped on a landmine that Nathan had planted. The psychological concept of projection can give some insight into David's words here. So he's projecting his own guilt onto the rich man in the parable. Though he was not consciously thinking of his own sin, he could harshly rebuke someone else exhibiting the same kind of behavior. This suggests that David subconsciously was quite aware of his guilt and felt the shame of his actions, but had not yet confessed it to himself or the Lord. So he's dealing with this internally. So when you get something like this that stirs up your emotions anyway, he's kind of, it's kind of a Freudian slip. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." Clues in the surrounding text indicate that this conversation between Nathan and David took place months after the offense occurred, on the occasion of the child's birth. By then, David had had time to rationalize his sins away and bury them in his mind. But try as he might, he could not forget what he had done. And as he now stood exposed before an all-knowing, all-seeing God, David himself was the rich man. And I thought about this, and how many times have we been in a situation where we're ranting or we're hearing somebody rant about something? The best analogy I have is when you're driving and somebody pulls out in front of you only to turn 3 seconds up the road. And I remember thinking, why did you do that for? You just wait, and then you get mad about it. And then I remember driving shortly after, and I'm thinking, I just did that last week. So we get all wrapped up, and it's so easy for us to kind of point the finger outward, but we don't want to look at self-help. I guess it's a lot easier to project like David did versus to kind of look inward and say, well, I do that too. I like this story. This kind of made me think of it. It's a traffic story. Am I guilty? It says, remember, we frequently have children on campus, so we all need to slow down in our driveway and parking lot. I'm not in agreement as I read the email from the facilities manager. I had seen coworkers driving too fast around the road that curves to our office. I tried to suppress my irritation. Why can't they just slow down? A few days later, I pulled into the parking lot in a rainstorm. I saw headlights in my rearview mirror as I parked. The facilities manager was leaning his head out of the window as I stood in the rain. "David, you need to slow down," he said. Flabbergasted, I mumbled an apology and retreated inside. It had never once entered my mind that the warning email might apply to me, but I was guilty. I mean, I'll personally admit I've been in that situation where you have somebody, we need to remember, this, we need to do this, and I'm sitting there nodding like, yeah, y'all need to listen to this. Who's doing this? And then it comes back later like, oh man, that was me. Why is it so hard to judge ourselves? The next time you encounter a call for changed behavior, put yourself in the hot seat. Are you guilty? This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. So Nathan's reminding David, exactly what his blessings were. You're the chosen one. You've had all this kind of given to you. So I mean, this is kind of piling the guilt on here. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. And it says here, for a new king to assume possession of the former king's wives as well as his house was the apparent custom of the day. This does not mean that David married the women, but instead that they were part of the package deal now under control of Israel and Judah as Saul's successor. David's acquisition of Saul's harem was thus a blessing, representing God's giving him the kingship. And the list of blessings does not stop there. God gave David the promise of an ongoing dynasty and a name like the greatest men on earth. How much more could David possibly want? And if all of this had been too little, the Lord had more to give. And it says, why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? Disobeying the Lord in the face of such extravagant evidence of favor was a wicked, sinful betrayal. In the course of events, David had violated the foundational commandments against coveting, adultery, and murder. So when you look at the whole sin, not only did he, commit adultery, but the husband of the wife, he's sentenced to death basically through military violence. So you struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. For the first time, Nathan named Uriah the Hittite. He called Bathsheba only Uriah's wife, not by her own name, emphasizing that David took a wife that was not his to take. The consequence listed in 2 Samuel fit the crime. because David had Uriah murdered by the sword of the Ammonites, the sword representing military violence would torment his own household. Since he took the wife of another man to be his own, someone close to him would now take his wives. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Prophets often spoke truth to power, only to find that power was not willing to listen or made excuses. But unlike Saul before him, David offered no excuse, nor did he lash out at Nathan for denouncing him. I mean, how many times have we been confronted with something and, the first thing you think of is, well, I did that, but I did that because of this. I mean, David's king, he's in a position where he could exert that power, and he immediately fesses up. Instead, he confessed the awful truth in the plainest language. Had he not sinned first against the Lord, the rest, Uriah, Bathsheba, and the countless others who would be affected by the consequences of his actions would not have become his victims. David was anointed king because he was a man after God's own heart. His confession here is surely one indication of why. Contrasting David with a later king, the Lord said that David had followed me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. Similar statements about David's wholehearted devotion to the Lord come in other comparisons. Only once later did the Lord add the qualifier, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. This should hearten the believer who continues to struggle against sin. Confession allows the heart to once again be fully devoted to the Lord. With the admission of sin, David would at last begin to unburden himself. And you saw that through the projection in the story, kind of the pent-up frustration and I guess anger against himself that he already had. And by immediately confessing, he's cleansed, that rock is lifted. He had felt the weight of his sin in his bones. David went on to write a penitential prayer for cleansing and restoration. Confession was the first step on the path to forgiveness for David and is for us. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. David deserved to die for his crimes, but the Lord once again showed himself to be compassionate, gracious, and forgiving of transgression and sin. Even so, David would experience both punishment and consequence. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. And he's talking about the son that he fathered with Bathsheba. As king in Israel, David brought dishonor not only to himself, but also to God. Not only had David's sin of adultery snowballed into murder, it would cause enemies who already displayed utter contempt for the Lord to blaspheme God all the more. So you think about it, he's not just a representation of his own sin. Enemies who already look at, the Israelites a certain way now have that to throw out. We'll look at, you're king, you're the chosen one, and look what you did. Far from shepherding the people in greater faithfulness to their God, David had demonstrated blatant disregard for God's standards. The death of this innocent son is stunning as a punishment for David's sin, but while it may seem to go against God's own declaration that he does not punish the child for the parent's sin, we need not assume that the child's death was a form of punishment for the baby. His death, along with the record of Nathan's prophecy, would be concrete evidence to the nation that the Lord saw David's sin and took it seriously. This example would ideally cause them to take their own sin seriously, knowing that God did not spare even his chosen king from discipline. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and she became ill. Bathsheba is again referred to as Uriah's wife to highlight the depravity of David's acts. For the next 7 days, David would watch and pray as the child sickened and eventually died. A sense of God's mercy and forgiveness would come with Solomon's birth. He continued the royal line that led to Jesus. Through the prophet Nathan, the Lord confronted David, but the Lord did not give up on David or his enduring dynasty. I'm at the conclusion. There is always a temptation when reading a story to put oneself in the shoes of the hero. I would run into a burning building to save a child. I would step in if I saw blatant discrimination in front of me. Of course, I would be Nathan confronting the sins of the powerful. But there is much to be gained by resisting the urge to identify with the hero. And if we're being honest, we are more frequently like David than a hero. We think our sins have passed by without consequence, that maybe even God didn't notice. We squash any gnawing guilt if no consequences manifest themselves, we must have been forgiven. Let David's story warn us against such attitudes. Our sins have consequences in others' lives, and sins we ignore instead of confess harden our hearts to other sins, making us complicit in the wickedness of others. The tendency to abuse our own influence must constantly be held in check. We must be willing not only to hold others to account, but also listen when Christian brothers and sisters do the same for us. By doing so, we will fulfill the words of Christ. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I think that's something that's still very prevalent today. You know, we're a judgmental society. It's human nature, but I think it's easier to, like I said earlier, it's easier to point the finger outward than to think, what am I guilty of the same thing? And speaking for myself, I would say every time I am. So not only is it a reflection on us or the individual, it's a reflection on everybody. You know, I would feel like I would be holding you guys to that same standard if it was me that was in David's shoes. I would feel like that's a reflection on everybody, because that's just who we are. So I think as we go through life, you know, it's hard, but I think we need to hold ourselves to the same standard that we try to hold other people. And that's what I got out of this. So hopefully y'all got something.